During dinner, my sister said she was pregnant and that the father was my husband. The words struck me like a thunderbolt, echoing in the chic Parisian restaurant, as if the walls themselves had conspired to amplify their cruelty. I thought I knew the people closest to me. I thought some boundaries were sacred. I thought I understood loyalty. I was wrong. My name is Camille Lefevre. I am 29. And this is the story of discovering how far people will go to satisfy their own desires, no matter who gets hurt in the process. It was a Thursday in early March when I finally received news that would have made any hard-working professional proud. My promotion. After 4 years at a bustling tech firm in Lyon, I was now the head of commercial strategy. My heart swelled with accomplishment. I couldn't wait to share the joy with the 2 people I loved most, or so I believed. I called Julian, my husband, and my younger sister, Amélie, to tell them. Let's celebrate tonight, at Le Mistral, I suggested, thinking of the chic bistro in the 2nd arrondissement, where a single dinner could rival a week's wages for a student. But I could afford it. I had worked for it. I arrived first, wearing a navy dress that Julian always said made me glow. I chose a secluded corner table, wanting a moment of privacy to savor the occasion. The restaurant was bustling with elegant couples and suited executives, a setting where I felt confident after years of climbing my career ladder. When I noticed them walking in together, my stomach twisted. Amélie was radiant, her smile unusually warm, the kind I hadn't seen in years. Julian seemed tense. He had always been a little uneasy in upscale places, but tonight it was different. There was an almost palpable tension, like electricity suspended in the air. "Congratulations, Camille," Amélie said, enveloping me in an unusually affectionate embrace. She had never been demonstrative with me before. I ordered a fine bottle of Keats du Rhône, $220, feeling a mix of pride and anticipation, and began recounting the projects I would lead, the 40% salary increase, and the possibilities for international growth. Amélie listened, hanging on my every word, while Julian fidgeted with his napkin as if trying to disappear into the tablecloth. Then she interrupted, holding Julian's hand across the table, and my world shifted. "We have news too," Amélie said softly. My stomach lurched inexplicably. "I'm pregnant," she revealed, eyes bright, and the restaurant around us seemed to blur into a distant hum. The lights flickered, or maybe it was my mind, and I stared at her hand, intertwined with Julian, as though I were hallucinating. Pregnant, with my husband's child. Julian finally spoke, his voice strangely calm. "It just happened. We fell in love." They watched me, their expressions a mixture of expectation and poorly concealed triumph, as if they had been waiting for this very moment. My reaction, my despair, my public collapse. But I could only stare, numb, as if the world had paused in anticipation of my destruction. My sister, the one I had helped through college when our parents couldn't, was here, smiling at me, claiming my husband as if it were a rightful prize. 3 months, Amélie added, tracing the outline of her still barely visible belly. I felt a cold fury rise, tinged with disbelief. 3 months. 3 months of deception, of lies woven into our daily lives. While I had labored for every promotion, every achievement, every dream I wanted to share with those I trusted most, I managed to ask, my voice strangely detached, "How long?" 3 months, she repeated, almost as if rehearsed, her tone light, careless. "It started right after your birthday." My birthday had been in December, And now it was May. 3 months. Months of betrayal, perfectly timed. Months of smiles while I toiled away at my office desk, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Julian looked at me expectantly, as if I was supposed to collapse in despair. But my voice remained calm, almost eerily so. "What do you want me to say?" I asked, my tone distant, as if observing a strange play in which I was forced to participate. "Congratulations," Amelie laughed nervously. "I know it's complicated, but love happens, right?" She touched her belly again, a subtle flourish, as if this gesture sealed the victory she had orchestrated over months of planning. I picked up my purse, leaving to crisp 50-euro notes on the table, more than enough to cover my part of the bill. Without a word, I rose and walked toward the exit. Julian called my name, but I didn't look back. In the reflective glass of the restaurant wall, I caught sight of them, Amelie and Julian, triumphant in their carefully constructed world, oblivious to the storm I would soon unleash. Growing up in Lyon, Amelie had always lived in my shadow, and it had eaten at her quietly but persistently. I was the responsible one, academically accomplished without visible effort. She was the youngest, the pampered one, perpetually protected. But no accolade, no success on my part, had ever been enough. Our parents, middle-class citizens, had tried to balance the scales, an accountant father, a literature teacher mother. They were fair, but fairness is often the enemy of ambition. When I had earned a scholarship to study business in Paris, Amelie dismissed it as rich girl luck. When I bought my first apartment in the Marais, she muttered about ambition I supposedly didn't deserve. When I landed my first high-profile job at a multinational, she noted with thinly veiled resentment that I always knew how to sell myself. Now it all made sense. Her jealousy, her resentment, her subtle but constant probing into my financial life had a purpose, a design. And Julian, dear naive Julian, had become the unwitting instrument of her plan. I returned home, my apartment undisturbed, a surreal calm surrounding me. Everything looked normal, but my life had changed irrevocably. Julian's toothbrush still sat on the marble counter, his coffee mug from the dealership perched smugly in its usual place. I sank into the beige leather sofa, the heels of my navy dress digging into the cushions, and stared into the void. My mind was silent, a curious, numbing silence where emotions should have roared. I should have cried, screamed, smashed the place, but I felt nothing. Just emptiness, as if the universe had paused, waiting for me to unravel, and I refused. At 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. A message from Julian. "I'm at Amelie S. We'll talk tomorrow. B. How intimate, how casual. As if our 4-year marriage had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, an obstacle neatly removed. And that was the moment I realized what had seemed like an abrupt betrayal was in truth a calculated performance. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I woke up in my apartment overlooking the Seine, the city bathed in soft, grey light. My apartment, a modestly elegant 2-bedroom flat in La Marie, seemed untouched, almost mocking in its calm. Everything was where I had left it the night before: croissants on the kitchen counter, my navy scarf draped neatly over the chair, my laptop humming softly on the desk. But the silence felt heavier, charged with the emptiness that only betrayal can create. I sat on the edge of the sofa in my black dress, the one I had worn to the restaurant, the fabric still pressed by the night's tension, and stared out the window. It felt surreal that life could go on as usual, while mine had been turned upside down in a single moment. Juliet, my sister, the one I had watched grow up, always a shadow to my achievements, had not only taken my husband, but had done so with the calculated precision of someone who had waited years for the right moment. And Alexander, my husband of 4 years, the man I had trusted, loved, and built a life with, had been complicit every step of the way. I had been working tirelessly, chasing milestones, dreaming of promotions, while they had been scheming behind my back, orchestrating a betrayal so intimate and cruel that even now, hours later, the sting was almost physical. I remembered our childhood in Lyon, a family that prided itself on appearances but quietly measured affection in achievements. Our father, a senior accountant at a boutique finance firm, and our mother, a literature teacher, had always valued diligence over emotion. I had been the model daughter, disciplined, organized, excelling effortlessly in school. Juliet, younger by 3 years, had grown up in my shadow, her resentment simmering quietly beneath polite smiles. She had always been clever, socially astute, and, I now realized, relentless in pursuit of what she believed was owed to her. I could see it clearly in her eyes that night at Tirso, that flicker of satisfaction, the self-congratulatory shine of someone convinced they had outmaneuvered the world. As I sipped my café noir, I remembered the small clues I had ignored for months. Juliet's sudden presence in Paris, ostensibly for freelance graphic projects, her frequent inquiries about my apartment, my salary, my investments. She had feigned interest, laughter, even shared moments of sisterly advice. But it was all a prelude, a rehearsed performance to gather information, to manipulate, to plan. Alexander, who had always avoided discussions about finances, had been a perfect accomplice, too easily swayed by her charm and the promise of a new life without effort. My heart hardened as I realized the depth of their strategy. They had timed the revelation for maximum humiliation. Coinciding with the celebration of my professional achievement, by mid-morning, after a restless sleep on the leather sofa, I began to act. I needed to reclaim some control, to remind myself that while they had taken trust from me, they could not take everything. I retrieved the small safe hidden behind the closet door, my hands trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside lay the prenuptial agreement I had insisted on years ago, back when Alexander had laughed at the notion of formal protections. He had signed without a thought, convinced it was a mere formality, an unnecessary obstacle in the path of love. I held the envelope in my hands, the seals intact, and felt the first flicker of relief since that night. This document was my shield, a concrete reminder that my efforts, my hard work, my investments were legally mine. I spent the morning reviewing every page meticulously. Property, investments, intellectual property, inheritance debts all clearly defined, all completely separated. Alexander had signed away any claim to what I had worked for, and in that moment I allowed myself a small, private smile. Juliet would have assumed that manipulating him was enough, that my resources were theirs by default, but they had underestimated my foresight. My life, carefully constructed over a decade of perseverance, was untouchable, yet the emotional damage remained. I felt an ache that no document could erase: the betrayal of love, the shattering of trust, the cruel comedy of seeing them believe they had won while I quietly held the upper hand. I reached for my phone and called my lawyer, Helene, in Lyon. She was calm, precise, and unsentimental, the perfect counterweight to the storm of emotions inside me. "Marina," she said, her voice steady, "I understand. This agreement changes everything. We can proceed with a divorce in 60 days if they do not contest. And even if they do, the law is entirely on your side. Alexander cannot touch a single asset without proving coercion or fraud, which is virtually impossible." I leaned back in the chair, letting the words sink in. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a vision of the future, not the one they had plotted for me, but my own. A future where my wealth, my independence, and my dignity remained intact. A future where I could continue building my career, perhaps even flourish beyond what I had imagined, unburdened by those who had sought to steal my life. Juliet had plotted. Alexander had played along, but I had prepared. And as I took another sip of my coffee, the grey Parisian sky casting muted light across the kitchen, I began to plan not revenge, not dramatics, but a calm, meticulous unraveling of their assumptions. They thought they had orchestrated my downfall. In reality, they had only revealed the extent of their own recklessness. And I intended to use that knowledge, legally, strategically, to ensure that while they had my trust, they would not have my world. Saturday arrived with the subtle hum of Paris in early spring. The streets were alive with the chatter of cafe patrons, the occasional hiss of tram brakes, and the faint aroma of freshly baked baguettes drifting from the boulangerie on the corner. I had rehearsed every detail of the evening in my mind, imagining the exact expression I wanted on Juliet's face, the tremor I anticipated in Alexandra's voice. Tirzo, the same restaurant where they had humiliated me, where they had orchestrated their revelation with such brazen precision. It was time to reclaim that space, not with anger, not with tears, but with calculated composure. I arrived promptly at 8, the heels of my black pumps clicking confidently against the cobblestone. My hair was neatly arranged, my makeup subtle, but polished, and my black dress, elegant and commanding, felt like armor. The maître d' greeted me with a hint of recognition, a soft comment about hoping for a happier night. I only smiled politely, acknowledging his words but revealing nothing of the storm contained within. When Juliet and Alexander entered together, arm in arm, the world seemed to slow again, though this time it was my gaze that dominated the scene. They were relaxed, smiling as if their victory had been secured. Juliet's small yet noticeable pregnancy bump was highlighted by a fitted dress, and Alexander, with his easy charm, looked pleased and untroubled. How naive they were to assume that my silence indicated weakness. Juliet approached first, her smile genuine or at least convincingly so. "Marina, you look radiant," she said, embracing me with a warmth that I returned with careful restraint. "That dress, magnifique." I allowed a faint, polite smile, nodding. Alexandra's eyes met mine briefly. A flicker of uncertainty I noted with quiet satisfaction. We were seated at the same table as before, and the ironic familiarity of the space did not escape me. The sommelier uncorked the bottle of Chianti, pouring each glass with elegance. My hands remained steady, my expression calm. This was not a scene for drama, it was a stage for revelation. Alexander began, attempting to assert control with rehearsed words. "Marina, we wanted to approach this amicably. We can divide everything fairly, without complications. It's best for all parties, especially with the baby." He gestured toward Juliet's belly, expecting perhaps gratitude or acceptance. I let the words hang in the air, savoring the audacity of their assumption. Then, calmly, I reached into my bag and placed the envelope containing the prenuptial agreement on the table. The sound of the paper against wood was deliberate, drawing their attention. "Before we talk about division," I said, my voice measured, "there's something I think you've forgotten." Juliet's smile faltered. Alexandra's face drained of color. "What is that?" he asked, his confident posture beginning to crack. "This," I said, opening the envelope and laying the pages flat between us. "Our prenuptial agreement, signed 4 years ago, complete separation of assets. Do you remember? I directed my gaze first at Alexander, then Juliet. Everything acquired before and during the marriage remains individual property. Everything, and spousal support, waived by both parties." Alexandra's trembling hands lifted the documents, his eyes scanning the text that now felt like an unfamiliar language to him. His protests began weakly, rising as he realized the truth. This isn't legal. You tricked me. I tricked you," I replied, voice calm, deliberate. "Alexander, you were present when the lawyer explained every clause. You signed. Witnesses filed at the courthouse. You waived any claim to my assets, voluntarily, knowingly." My eyes swept to Juliet, whose expression had shifted from confidence to panic. "Even with a prenup," she began, her voice shaky, There's community property division of what was acquired together. Not when there is complete separation of assets," I said, pointing to the exact clause. "Everything in my name remains mine. Your hopes of taking anything beyond child support are unfounded." A quiet tension settled over the table. Alexandra's jaw tightened, his confident demeanor collapsed into a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Juliet flipped through the pages, desperate, searching for some loophole, some invisible clause that might save them. There was none. Every sentence, every stipulation, a meticulous fortress protecting what I had built. And as for alimony, I continued, letting the weight of each word land. "You waived that as well. With your current income, child support is all that applies. Calculated fairly under French law for the welfare of the child. Nothing more." I paused, watching the reality dawn on them. Juliet's face paled, the confidence she had so carefully cultivated replaced by a sudden, vulnerable fear. Alexander leaned back, defeated, muttering incoherently, his hands raking through his hair. I allowed myself a small, private smile. The humiliation they had intended for me, the sense of triumph they had believed was theirs, was now fully reversed. I did not shout, I did not cry, merely existed in the truth of my preparation. The calm authority that comes from knowing you hold the cards. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of satisfaction, not cruel, but just. They had thought me powerless, naive, unaware. They had underestimated foresight, diligence, and the foresight to protect oneself. And as I watched them sit, struggling to comprehend the fortress I had built around my life, I realized that while betrayal could wound, it could never destroy. Careful planning, intelligence, and the quiet strength that comes from loving oneself enough to safeguard one's future. The following week, the city of Paris seemed quieter somehow, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of a private war I had quietly prepared to wage. I spent the days meticulously gathering all necessary documentation, revisiting contracts, bank statements, investment accounts, and correspondence that reflected my financial autonomy. Each page I touched reminded me of the life I had built, not inherited, not gifted, but earned through years of relentless effort and careful decision-making. Helena, my confidant and legal counsel, worked with precision. her calm authority a steady anchor amid the storm. "Marina, everything is in order," she assured me during our video call from Houston. "Alexander has no legal leverage. The prenup is airtight. Complete separation of assets, spousal support waived, debts separate. You are untouchable legally." I smiled, feeling a rare sense of security. Untouchable, what a delicious thought after the humiliation of that dinner at Tirso, yet I knew that legal victory alone would not satisfy the psychological dimension. Juliet and Alexander had attempted to manipulate, to humiliate, to assert power over me, and I intended to demonstrate, quietly but unmistakably, that the tables had turned. Saturday night approached, and I returned to the restaurant that had witnessed the apex of their betrayal. I had requested the same secluded table, my mind orchestrating every movement and gesture like a scene from a play. The maître d' greeted me with a knowing nod, a small, conspiratorial smile acknowledging the contrast between my first visit and tonight. I let the smile remain subtle, like a promise of what was to come. Juliet and Alexander arrived together. Their coordinated appearance intended to convey normalcy, confidence, and triumph. Instead, they found me calm, composed, almost serene. Juliet's hand rested lightly on her growing belly, a gentle touch meant to remind all observers of the supposed leverage she wielded. Alexandra's posture was upright, the easy charm he carried earlier replaced with an undercurrent of nervous energy. I noted it all with the precision of a strategist reading an opponent's tell. We exchanged pleasantries, polite and measured. Juliet's usual assertive warmth was present, but it lacked its prior edge. Alexander attempted a casual small talk, but the familiar rhythm of his confidence faltered under the weight of expectation he sensed but did not fully comprehend. I allowed them to speak, nodding occasionally, projecting an air of dignified patience. Then, at the precise moment, I placed the envelope with the prenup on the table. Alexandra's eyes widened, and Juliet's confident smile wavered. I did not need to speak immediately. The papers themselves were a statement. Alexander reached for the envelope with hesitant hands, flipping through pages, his prior bravado dissolving into a mix of disbelief and frustration. Juliet's voice trembled slightly. We thought you thought wrongly," I interrupted gently, allowing my calm to magnify the absurdity of their expectations. "Everything in my name remains mine. Investments, property, intellectual property, savings. Spousal support waived, debts separate. Alexander, your pickup truck, your credit card, your salary. None of it entitles you to a single euro beyond child support." Their faces shifted almost imperceptibly from shock to panic. Juliet tried to interject, flailing slightly as she searched the documents for loopholes. Alexandra's hands clenched the pages, scanning desperately, muttering fragments of protest that were absorbed by the polite murmurs of other diners. They had calculated a moment of public humiliation. I had transformed it into a demonstration of controlled strategic power. I allowed a faint, private smile, savoring the irony. Juliet had sought wealth through seduction. Alexander had sought comfort through betrayal, and both had assumed that my kindness and trust would remain an open door. The tables had turned. They were now forced to confront not only the legal reality, but the moral and strategic consequences of their choices. The dinner progressed with careful politeness. We discussed logistics, not as adversaries, but as adults navigating a framework in which I held all authority. They proposed an amicable arrangement, their words laced with a desperation thinly veiled beneath civility. I agreed to discuss child support and parental responsibilities, but drew firm boundaries around all financial matters. Everything beyond that was closed, sealed, legally untouchable. As I watched them leave, the tension in their shoulders and the uncertainty in their eyes, I felt a subtle satisfaction. Not cruelty, but justice. The betrayal had been spectacular. The response had been elegant, controlled, and complete. The night air of Paris felt lighter as I walked home, knowing that the fortress of careful planning, legal protection, and mental resilience I had constructed was not only unbreachable but empowering. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine the future unencumbered by fear, betrayal, or dependency. I had survived the audacity of those closest to me, and I had done so without compromising my integrity or my hard-earned achievements. The lesson was clear. Vigilance, preparation, and self-respect were shields against the unexpected betrayals of the heart. By the time I reached my apartment, the skyline of Paris glittered softly under streetlights, a reminder that life continued, unpredictable yet navigable with prudence and determination. I poured a glass of wine, savoring its warmth, and allowed myself a quiet smile. Tonight, the narrative had shifted. I was no longer the one humiliated, no longer the naive observer of betrayal. I was the author of my destiny, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of unshakable control. The days that followed were a careful balance between normalcy and vigilance. Paris seemed to hum along as if unaware of the private storm I had weathered. I returned to work, resuming my role as commercial director with an intensity sharpened by betrayal and fortified by legal clarity. Every project I led, every decision I made, carried the subtle confidence of someone who had survived an intimate betrayal and emerged unscathed. Juliet and Alexander maintained contact, though it was now filtered through the lens of my strategic boundaries. Child support arrangements were formalized, precise, and monitored, ensuring the child's welfare while safeguarding my autonomy. Alexandra's attempts to negotiate or manipulate were met with calm reminders of the prenup and the legal realities he had signed years before. Juliet's occasional calls, attempts at persuasion, were polite but ultimately futile. Plans had collapsed under the weight of preparation and foresight she had underestimated. I spent evenings reflecting, walking along the Seine, absorbing the cool air and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the embankments. I thought about my younger self, the one who had trusted love above all else, the one who had believed that emotional bonds could protect against betrayal. I no longer blamed myself entirely. Rather, I acknowledged that awareness and foresight were now indispensable tools in navigating relationships, personal or professional. At home, the apartment that once symbolized a solitary victory now represented sanctuary. Every investment, every acquisition, every carefully planned decision was a tangible affirmation of my independence. I allowed myself to enjoy the space, the art on the walls, the soft lighting, and the knowledge that no one could dismantle the life I had built without my consent. I relished small rituals, making coffee in the morning while overlooking the city, reading late into the night, planning travel and projects, rediscovering the joy of personal autonomy. The psychological impact of their betrayal remained, though it gradually transformed. Anger and hurt were replaced with clarity and discernment. I learned to detect subtle manipulations in others, to recognize envy masked as curiosity, and to fortify my boundaries without hostility. I nurtured relationships with friends and colleagues who respected integrity, loyalty, and effort, people who would support rather than exploit. Months later, a quiet satisfaction took root. Juliet's attempts to leverage her pregnancy into influence over my life were met with polite distance and legal certainty. Alexander, now adjusting to his responsibilities and financial limitations, seemed a smaller figure than he had appeared, diminished not by malice, but by his own misjudgment. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer vulnerable to the whims of those who had once sought to control me in the evenings. I sometimes allowed myself a private acknowledgement of triumph, not vindictive, not vengeful, but an appreciation of resilience, preparation, and wisdom. I had confronted a betrayal that could have unraveled everything I had built and emerged whole, intact, and even more capable. My success was no longer just professional, it was personal, psychological, and unassailable. And yet, life continued to surprise. I met new people, pursued new passions, and opened doors that I had previously ignored in the haze of betrayal. Relationships, work, and personal growth became exercises in intent. Every action, every choice, was informed by experience. I refused to be blindsided again, not by deceit, not by envy, not by love gone astray. Looking out over Paris one night, the city lights shimmering on the Seine, I realized I had reclaimed something far more valuable than assets or social standing. I had reclaimed myself. The lessons of Juliet and Alexander, the envy, the betrayal, the manipulation had been transformed into armor. I was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more discerning. I allowed a smile, genuine and unguarded. The past was behind me. The future, open and promising, belonged to me alone. No one could claim it without my consent. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free, not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. Paris breathed around me, a city of light, history, and possibilities. And I knew that I was ready to step forward into a life defined not by the betrayals I had endured, but by the strength I had cultivated. The story of that night at the betrayal, the strategy, and the resolution would remain a private testament to resilience. I had faced what I feared most and emerged not just intact, but empowered. And in that realization, I understood the most vital truth. No one could ever take from me what I had built through effort, foresight, and unwavering self-respect. I took a final sip of wine. The city lights reflected in the glass and whispered to myself, almost as a promise, "This is only the beginning."